So thank you so much for joining us for our second webinar of 2022 here at the Indiana Grown for Schools Network. This month, we are very excited to have Dominique Edwards with us to present on the racial disparities in the food system. As a few housekeeping notes, please ensure that you are muted. If you are not muted, one of us will mute you if possible, if we have the power to do so, but please remain on mute as much as possible while Dominique is presenting to cut down on background noise. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and so all things so that what Dominique presents on can be shared on our website. So just as an FYI, it is being recorded. So if that is something that you would not like, it's perfectly fine to exit and you can view this after it has been recorded, but this is a recorded webinar. Okay, other than that, I don't think we have any housekeeping tips. I'm sure people will roll in here and we'll ensure to emit them and mute them. If you have just joined us, please ensure that you stay on mute to cut down on the noise for Dominique's presentation. But without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Dominique Edwards. Dominique is a Black land steward, local educator, and urban planner based in Northwest Indiana. She also serves as the Northern Region Representative for the American Planning Association's Indiana chapter, and she previously served as the chair of the chapter's newly formed Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Dominique co-authored alongside her planning peers on the state level a call to action to address systemic oppression in the field of urban planning in the American Planning Association Indiana chapter's equity statement in 2020. Dominique is a 2016 graduate of DePaul University's Sustainable Urban Development graduate program, and while attending DePaul was passionate about revitalizing local food systems through the development of community gardens. As a student, Dominique was one of the co-founders of the Northwest Indiana Food Council, where she still serves today, working to build a just, sustainable, and revitalized food system for all of Northwest Indiana. Since graduating from DePaul, Dominique has advanced her work in food systems and has become multidisciplined in the field of urban planning. She is featured in the children's book, One Earth, People of Color Defending the Planet, which highlights some of her work to revitalize local food systems. As a student, Dominique developed a spatial model to observe how residents were accessing food in deindustrialized cities. She began by implementing the model into cities such as Gary, extending the model into East Chicago, and working to develop a similar model for South Bend. Dominique not only works to analyze the food system of cities spatially, but utilizes her findings to educate and inform policymakers of what the local and regional food system looks like for Northwestern Indiana. With the spatial model and data findings, Dominique presented her research at Harvard University at the Just Food Forum in 2016, as well as to Indiana legislatures to advocate for changes in policy, specifically for funding opportunities for marginalized communities to address food insecurity. Today, Dominique continues to work on many levels, including nationally, to educate other urban planners and policymakers about Northwestern Indiana's food system challenges. She also manages a community garden in her neighborhood and works with residents, local farmers, and representatives of other subject matter areas such as public health and academia to address food insecurity and implement local programming and policies to support systematically excluded communities. Not only does Dominique work on multiple levels to address food insecurity, but she also works directly with residents to grow food, educate, develop programs, and community food projects in other communities. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dominique.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to present in regards to this particular presentation and have this discussion with all of you. First and foremost, I want to go ahead and pose a question to everyone. I think you can go ahead and just put some of your answers into the chat so that we don't have to have a lot of folks unmuting themselves and having a lot of the background noise. So who owns the land? Who has land access and who has rights to the land? So I want to kind of throw that question out there to folks right now, and kind of if you go ahead and put some of those answers into the chat. And I just kind of want to see and kind of hear, well, I can't see unfortunately, but kind of maybe hear and listen to kind of what some thoughts kind of come to mind when you're asked that question. So let's get into some of the historical impacts of land access and really rights to land. So we're looking at the system of slavery, and we're looking at policy changes such as segregation that initiated the rise of discriminatory zoning and lending practices. And so this really sets the stage for how our cities look, both urban and rural. Let's get into talking a little bit about Black land loss. There are some major contributions to Black land loss. So we're looking at things such as the Emancipation Proclamation. So although this freed enslaved persons, it did not allow them to have the right to own land. Lack of documentation, sharecropping, redlining, partition sales are some other massive contributions to Black land loss, especially when we get into talking about things such as sharecropping and redlining. So redlining, if folks are unfamiliar with that, that's the predatory lending practices that really adversely impacted the Black community and other immigrant communities and things like that. So in the 1930s, the federal government began the system of redlining, which began marking neighborhoods as risky, especially for federal mortgage loans, and that was based on race. So we're looking at the contributions of Black land loss and also some policy changes on the national level that also contributed significantly to lack of access to land, especially for the Black community. We also have the Great Migration. So from 1916 to 1917, we saw the largest influx of a population shift across the nation. So we had an estimated of 6 million Black Southerners that relocated from the rural communities in the South to urban areas in the North and in the West. A lot of these families were migrating from the South, trying to escape racial terrorism and a number of other atrocities that were happening in the South. So let's kind of look at the migration and development patterns that were happening as well. So, and this is how really our cities, both urban and rural, are built today. And we see a lot of that. So we see that families migrated from the rural areas to the city level in the urbanized areas. And then we started getting into the first wave of suburbanization. So although folks were migrating from the rural South and other areas and other rural areas and migrating into the city, a lot of issues were happening in the city. A lot of crime, a lot of destitution, a lot of things that were happening in the city were starting to impact migration in another way as well. So we were starting to see the first wave of suburbanization, and then we started to see the second wave of suburbanization, where it gave rise to the rural community. I'm sorry, it gave rise to gated communities. And then these population shifts continue to happen, and it especially starts to negatively impact land use. So as Northern planners were starting to see these population shifts happening, Northern planners began to adopt and implement policies from Southern planners, which forced Black Southerners, especially, and other ethnic groups into slums, ghettos, and tenements because they felt that these groups would lower property values. So Northern planners were utilizing and implementing policies on the national scale that mimicked Jim Crow South. So now we're looking at the spatial isolation and what our current food system looks like and how that's impacted. So discriminatory zoning practices and spatial isolation have had impacts on our current infrastructure and what our cities are built or look like today. And they have negatively impacted our current food system across the nation. So for example, we have a redlining map from 1937 for the city of Indianapolis. And then next to it, we have our 2019 city of Indianapolis's food desert map. So as you can see, some of the areas that were redlined in 1937 are some of the mimic or mirror some of the areas that are considered as food deserts for the city of Indianapolis as of 2019. Indiana, whether folks know it or not, is the 10th largest farm state in the US, yet still 90% of the food that Indiana residents eat is actually sourced outside of the state. And in particular, 98% of fruits and vegetables that Hoosiers eat are actually imported into Indiana. Now let's get into food apartheid. And this particular slide, well, I think that we can honestly see that both urban and rural, we see a lot of Dollar Generals, right? And so, but what does this have to do with food apartheid? And actually, what is food apartheid? A lot of folks are yet to know or understand what food apartheid is. So apartheid is actually a policy and a system of segregation based on the grounds of race that originated in South Africa. But food apartheid in and of itself, that is a social construct, and it devalues human beings, and it assumes that people are basically unworthy of having access to nutritious foods, and it impacts folks of all races, but it disproportionately impacts communities of color, specifically the Black community. So there are significant disparities in the food system, especially along the lines of race, gender, and class. And these disparities are amongst those who are food insecure become even wider. So for example, the food justice movement, this spurred from the lack of access to fresh food in communities of color, specifically these communities of color. Well, there are higher rates of nutritional-based illnesses, not only due to lack of access of nutritional-based food, but also due to disinvestment, historical factors, even urban design, and some of the issues that I spoke about earlier. The activist Karen Washington, she talks about food apartheid, and she says that when we're talking about food apartheid, we need to look at the whole food system, especially along the lines of race, geography, even faith, especially economics. When we say food apartheid, you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. And so it brings in hunger, it brings in poverty, and brings us more to the question of what are some of the social inequalities that you see, and what are you doing to erase some of those injustices? Here's some of the resources that I highly recommend for folks to read if you're wanting to know more information in regarding to this particular presentation. You can read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. That'll go deeply into the system of redlining. You can read even about the history of zoning in Chicago. I definitely highly recommend Collective Courage and Farming While Black, as well as Freedom Farmers. So I'll open up the floor for any questions so that we can kind of get into more of a discussion around these topics.
Feel free to use the raise hand function, which should be at the top of your screen, or put a question or comment in the chat. I can read them out of the chat if that's what you prefer. Andrea?
Hello, thanks so much, Dominique, for this presentation. Are you finding some cities trying to make some amends with some of the redlining and other things to do some investments in communities that were structurally segregated and kind of diminished?
Thank you for your question, Ms. Andrea. Yes, actually, I do see some cities that are trying to move the needle forward regarding, especially regarding disinvestment. So looking to implement more programs, looking to implement more resources, especially in regards to food insecurity and other historical issues as well.
Do you know any of those by chance? We're doing some research in our city to want to look at some best practices and movement of cities, stepping up and doing the investment.
Yes, actually, you can look at some of the examples of from the city of South Bend. I believe there's some examples from the city of Atlanta and also the city of Baltimore, especially in regards to the food systems work in the food system space.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Dominique, we have a question in the chat. Generally, do you feel that there is improvement or shifts in the right direction around these topics?
I would say there is some shift. It's a slow shift, but there is some shift, and there are some cities that are working to build more equitable frameworks. They're also implementing, diversity and inclusion offices. They're looking into examining, current policies or historical policies to look into where equity can be implemented into their cities, infrastructure, into how to, even provide more resources into disinvested communities as well.
Fantastic. Naima has commented, Miss Andrea, that the city of Indianapolis is also doing a lot within that space and might be some place to look. I have a particular question. Dominique, I was wondering if you could further expand upon the idea of partition sales or sometimes or the practice of heirs property and what that means, I guess how that plays out in practice and what that means for our food system.
So with partition sales, that actually, it's very tricky because what happens with that is that, say you have a parcel of land or a plot of land, you don't have a single owner of that land or someone who has access to that land, but you either have two owners or maybe more owners. So that becomes very tricky regarding, once you try to get into getting appropriate access to that land. So say one owner bows out of that land, but you don't have the appropriate paperwork or the appropriate deeds and whatnot, and to be able to claim that land, it makes it harder to get the entirety of that land and things like that. So those are so that's kind of what's really tricky about partition sales and things like that.
Naima, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And thank you so much, Dominique, for being here today. I think my question is kind of digging in a little more around the concept of food apartheid. One thing that I think is like really important about that term, especially in contrast to food deserts, is that it really emphasizes the intentionality around a lot of these food landscapes, as you were referencing earlier. And I think sometimes people tend to oversimplify that intentionality in terms of just looking at redlining as the only sort of policy solution to address food apartheid. I'm wondering if I'm thinking about food apartheid as something that's not naturally occurring and as a result of very intentional systems and processes and policies. What are some additional very intentional approaches that we can focus on from either a systems perspective or a policy perspective in addition to redlining?
Thank you so much for expanding, and thank you so much for expanding on that, Naima. I probably should have gone into a little bit more detail, especially regarding food deserts versus food apartheid. So, and and I think that, especially for the state of Indiana, that we're starting to gain more traction on utilizing food apartheid versus food deserts, because we're more so very much focused on food deserts as that comes down from like the federal side, especially from the USDA, as the USDA highly uses food deserts versus food apartheid. But I think that those of us who have been doing a lot of grassroots work are picking up that and being more intentional about our language as we're trying to focus more on like that systems thinking, right? And so I think that it's very much has to be a systems approach in the way that we continue to work to revitalize things on a local level, especially our food system. And we're putting more in where a lot of us, of course, are very very much more intentional about our work, especially on the local level, but making sure that we have the right language in place, and utilizing food apartheid versus food deserts is incredibly important, because that really emphasizes not just because, like you said, folks will think that with a food desert that it's something that is naturally occurring, and it's not, right? We have to very much think about a lot of the contributions that I briefly mentioned earlier, especially redlining, other race-based policy making that has driven resources, basic resources, especially food, out of disinvested communities and systemically excluded communities. So we have to really be thinking about a systems approach as well as an institutional approach, right? Looking within the institutions in which we work and that we navigate, looking at different policies, looking at how resources are being allocated or reallocated into different communities and into these disinvested communities, to try to make sure that, one, we are always thinking about the historical factors, right? So when I think that, especially from an institutional standpoint, that we do not talk enough about the historical framework that has set the stage and gotten us to where we are today, to be able to, because we have to really understand the framework and the landscape that has taken place over the decades, centuries even, to better understand, well, how did we get here, and why are we here, and how do we move the needle forward in an appropriate way to where, one, we are decreasing the harm, right, that has already been implemented and that has already happened over such a long period of time, and how do we start being more genuine about the work that we do. Are there any more questions in the chat, or?
Anne, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I would like to know a little bit more about the differences in history of Black land loss between the North and the South, and if you've come across anything different about food apartheid and Black land loss because of that historical difference in community development between northern and southern states.
I think I think what's really interesting about the difference between the challenges with Black land loss in northern and southern states is that historically, Black Southerners lost their access to land due to racial terrorism, right? And a lot of Black farmers were either forced off of their land and put into positions where they would be harmed, right? And then also, I would have to expand on the advancements in technology, especially, that has also been major contributors in continuing to not have access to land, as well as some of the institutional and systemic barriers, right? So getting into maybe some of the historical cases like Pigford versus Glickman, right, where we have Black farmers that were trying to obtain access to resources through the USDA and other institutions, and not being able to obtain the appropriate either funding or equipment or things like that. So, and I think that from the differences between Black land loss as it pertains from north to south, I also think of some of the urban farmers in the city of Detroit that were having a lot of issues some years back regarding access to land, even in urban settings. So there's still these continued historical challenges that Black farmers are being faced with, either rural or urban and vice versa, and also the systemic and institutional challenges. And so as it pertains to food apartheid, we see a long legacy as well, where we have systemic and institutional barriers that continue to make access to resources even wider, right, for Black farmers. And so Black farmers have not had the opportunity to appropriately have land access or land ownership since 1910. So only 1% of land has been able to be obtained by Black farmers since 1910.
Yeah, and Dominique, thank you for bringing up like the Pigford versus Glickman case. I think it reinforces one of your contributors to Black land loss in your list of lack of documentation, that even though that was a class action lawsuit, that there were a lot of people who were still not able to retroactively collect benefits out of that class action lawsuit because of their lack of documentation. So while the USDA did admit to discriminatory lending practices, not everyone was able to reap the benefits of that class action lawsuit. I think Miss Andrea has her hand up again.
Yes. What are some of your next steps and activities you've got for yourself in this area of work?
Probably continue. Well, growing season is upon us. As you see, we have this massive meltdown happening. It's 40 degrees, almost 50 degrees here. So spring is kind of creeping up. So that means it's almost time to start growing again. So those are some of the current things that I have going on in the community garden that I manage in my old neighborhood, is coming up on its 5th growing season. So
thank you.
Okay, and we have another question in the chat. What are some of the contemporary institutional barriers that Black farmers face?
So what I heard was, what are some of the contemporary barriers, institutional barriers that Black farmers face?
Right.
So some of the things that I have heard over the years that Black farmers have dealt with was, historically, they would go into the USDA. They would try to obtain loans, and well, some of the loan officers would either spit in the faces of Black farmers, or they would fall asleep during their interview process for trying to obtain funding. So those are just some of the things that we have heard. Also some of the also, there being state-sanctioned violence against Black farmers as well, where they have been intentionally and forcibly forced off of their land. So, there's quite a few institutional barriers that are faced. Also, lack of representation as well, especially lack of representation. Even when there was representation for Black farmers, again, those are massive. There were still massive challenges within the institutional structures. So I think that things are starting to get better, especially as folks are starting to get more privy to diversity and equity and inclusion work within these institutions and organizations. So hopefully, but still, we have these decades-long battles that have continued to happen, right? And so it's going to take more than representation. We literally need to be doing policy making and policy changes.
Yes, and Denise is commenting in the chat, lack of information from employees, and total disrespect for wanting to farm.
Exactly. Especially lack of information, lack of transparency, lack of clarity for processes. There's a long list of institutional challenges that Black farmers have faced regarding either having rights to the land or trying to gain basic resources.
I think you've touched on this question a little bit, but when thinking about urban and rural settings, how has the history shaped these food systems differently? And also, I guess part two of the question would be like, what are barriers that might be more unique to rural areas or urban areas, such as like zoning laws in urban areas that might prevent people from gardening or farming?
Well, what I have found is that there's a lot of cities that actually don't have any type of policies set in stone to, as well, especially in the urban sense, not so much as the rural sense, but mostly the urban sense, where, you know, folks aren't, how do you say, folks don't have the, I wouldn't say that folks don't have the ability or they're not allowed to either garden or farm kind of where they are, especially in our urban setting. But of course, when you think about the institutional barriers or the institutional challenges, especially for municipalities, say somebody has maybe a small garden, or maybe they're doing permaculture and somebody from code enforcement doesn't understand what permaculture is. Maybe they just see tall grass or things like that. So that can definitely arise and give rise to some institutional challenges between residents and the municipality. So say somebody also from the rural sense, well, I don't think that there's a lot of barriers from the rural sense in allowing folks to be able to freely farm and garden, right? But in regards to the food system and how things are built, you have a lot of rural areas that, you know, are maybe one-stop like towns that in the closest grocery store or access to appropriately fresh food is maybe 10 miles or more away, or in the next city or the next town. So the way in which our cities have been built, especially around some of these systems, and especially around lack of access to appropriate resources, has really driven this massive divide. So even in urban areas where folks might be roughly 3 miles or more away from the closest grocery store, there still are significant barriers, right? Because we don't think about the transportation system or folks having access to transportation. We don't think about communities being walkable, and especially if they are walkable, well, what resources do they have? You know, they might not have a grocery store. They might not have other resources that they can access that are walkable. And then what about areas that also don't have, and I can go back and forth, what about this, what about this, what about this? But these are definitely things that have to be thought about, right? So lack of appropriate transportation, zero car households, areas that don't have sidewalks or other walkable safe infrastructure, accessibility of that infrastructure for folks who might be wheelchair utilizers and things like that. And then of course in rural areas, a lot of those areas are not walkable or have appropriate resources, you know, and so we, as you saw my slide earlier with food apartheid and the Dollar Generals, there's been this massive rise of a Dollar General. So, you know, say you go down the street one week and come back down the street the next week and you're like, huh, what's that? Something's being built that's new, and it's a Dollar General. Right. And so, especially both urban and rural, you'll see a Dollar General before you see a you know, any other kind of larger or other kind of grocery store. But from what I understand, that there's some changes in the rural versus urban Dollar Generals, right? Some Dollar Generals actually sell fresh produce. Other Dollar Generals do not, but they're starting to get a little bit more privy to the needs of the community, but a lot of them are not accessible. A lot of them are, and I mean accessible in regards to individuals with disabilities who might be wheelchair utilizers. So a lot of the areas are kind of narrow and things like that. And so that's something that some municipalities, I don't think, take into account, is the quality of some of the businesses that are coming into areas that are disinvested.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. We have another question in the chat. Given what you have described, the historical framework of institutional oppression and racial terrorism, what are some best practices for engaging Black farmers and producers? What are some good first steps to building authentic relationships that might predicate systems level change?
That's a really great question. I think that first and foremost is being authentic and being intentional when you're trying to engage with Black farmers is a great way to go. I think that, and honestly, just being truthful, right? Do you need something from them? Are you working to try to build an equitable framework? Are you an organization, or are you an institution that is working to kind of right those historical wrongs? Are you someone who might be a private landowner, right? And you're thinking of, hey, I don't want this parcel of land anymore. Maybe I need to give it to somebody who I know knows how to work the land, or things like that. Are you thinking of a potential reparations framework? So these are all very much things that need to be kind of thought about and kind of discussed in such a way that says, I want to be intentional about how I engage with special groups like this. So.
I know you've done some work applying your spatial model to deindustrialized, more urban settings, but I'm wondering if you use your spatial model or spatial models to evaluate rural food landscapes, and if so, like what were the differences that you saw in that experience, and maybe what are the different approaches to take from a systems level in a rural area versus in an urban area?
I haven't had the opportunity to apply this landscape to a rural setting yet. I think that what folks don't know about GIS, or if you've heard about GIS or geographic information systems, is that sometimes it's very hard to get data and being able to develop spatial models regarding data. So, and sometimes those data sets don't exist. So sometimes we actually have to create data sets to be able to build a spatial model of a city. So. Are there any more questions?
If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to raise your hand or comments and put them in the chat box. On a personal note, Dominique, can you, I guess, give us a little history or background about what got you interested and really engaged in this space and in this work, how you decided to apply your urban planning background to the food system?
So actually, my story is actually pretty personal. So in 2009, I lost my mother to pneumonia, but her pneumonia was actually brought on by her complications with her diabetes. So my father that summer actually started to grow food again. He just really wanted a garden. And so that's how I ended up in this space. And from 2009 to 2012, we grew food as a family. And then it wasn't until 2012 where I said, hey, there's these things that exist called community gardens, and I really want a community garden to be in my hometown of Michigan City. And so that's when I started to really kind of get into this space. And so one thing that I really didn't have a firm grasp on, because I actually came from natural sciences, was community engagement and how to appropriately engage with my community around food systems work. And so I actually went back to DePaul to get my master's degree in 2014. So after a couple of years of trying to get a community garden off the ground. And so it was pretty hard. And my research advisor, Howard Rosing, at the time, posed a really good question. It's not that. And it was not that people wanted a community garden. Why did they need a community garden? So I think that there wasn't like appropriate questioning such as that, and deeper questioning. And really, it's not that deep of a question. It really is a very simple question. It's not why do people want a community garden? Why do they need a community garden? And so before I knew it, I was kind of in this space of really decolonizing my own thinking around basic resources, right? And then looking at the built environment. So it wasn't just lack of access to food, but it was also lack of access to transportation, housing, healthcare, education, all these very basic needs. In 2018, the Alice report, I believe it was 2018, the Alice report for the city of Michigan City was published, where it found that 53% of our community didn't have access to their most basic needs. So, and if you probably look at other areas that have similar reports, you'll find, you'll find similar statistics. So my story is very personal. So, and really, I thank my father a lot for getting me into this space. So this work for me is not just generational, but also ancestral, because my family, my father's family is from the South, from Mississippi. I still have family there. They still farm. And so this has been really coming back home, walking myself back home.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You can really tell the passion in your voice, and I'm very thankful that you took the time to speak with us all today. There's someone in the chat who would love to revisit your initial question you posed to the group, which was who owns the land, and to get your thoughts on that. We did have some responses come in through the chat a little delayed, so I can read those off if you would like. We have a few of those, but we'd love to hear your take on that question as well.
So there's a reason that I refer to myself as a Black land steward, right? Due to the historical significance and the historical factors regarding lack of land access for Black people, it's very important that we are more so as stewards of the land and not owners of the land. Because as we are stewards of the land, that means that we have a more parallel relationship to the earth and relationship to nature, rather than claiming and forcing this ownership onto the land, right? So that's kind of I wouldn't say it's a hot take. I think that's what the kids say. This is a hot take, but
yeah, I think some people in the chat definitely agree with you and have a similar take on what you had just explained. We have some responses in here that include that someone is always thinking about future generations when that question is posed. Farm co-ops. Naima expressed feeling uneasy about thinking about owning land, that land and earth belongs to all of us and to no one. Comments that land owning feels both empowering and deeply wrong. And that ownership is a man-made construct to justify who can have it and who cannot. We do have one other question, I think, sitting in here. What are the best steps to establishing a community garden? What did you learn from your experience in establishing a community garden within your home community? If you are speaking, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you guys so much for those comments, especially in regards to land ownership. I also think that, well, community gardening is hard. And I kind of go back and forth with other folks regarding best practices for starting community gardens, because folks used to say that most community gardens will only have a life cycle of 3 to 5 years. And honestly, we kind of go back and forth with that statistic because there are community gardens that end up turning into massive urban farming projects, right? So it takes folks, it takes dedication, it takes passion, but also it takes a community, right? It's kind of in the name. So getting your community involved, getting your neighbors involved, well, it's really important. So, and that determines really the longevity of your project. So honestly, hey, and especially gardening is very hard work. It's very labor intensive, especially if you're talking about growing food on a community level, especially if that's the only resource for fresh food in your neighborhood as well. So a lot of your neighbors and family rely on that resource. So I would start by having a genuine and authentic conversation with your neighbors. Maybe if you have a neighborhood that has an established neighborhood association, that's really important too. I would say leverage all of your resources, because honestly, it's not just access to land or a plot of land. That actually is, most days are starting to become easier to obtain than it is actually getting the kind of the group and the workforce behind it to keep it going. So, because you can start it, but it's really about if you have the ability to keep it going.
Ms. Andrea, go ahead.
Thank you. Being an urban planner, have you gotten involved with some cities in the overall holistic work of planning, or is it primarily just with gardening and food apartheid?
What I'm hearing is, am I more involved in planning work in a holistic sense to
Yes.
combat food apartheid is what you're asking?
Well, no, just in other parts of urban planning in other areas,
Mhm.
beyond just the food aspect of needs of citizens, and
Yes.
helping a city do better planning in general, especially for their future plans.
Yes and no. So food insecurity is a really tough space, but it's also starting to gain increased popularity as some municipalities are starting to realize that food is an important part of their infrastructure. I also have experience with working in regional government and transportation planning processes. So there's, like I said, there's planning is very multidisciplined, right? So you can either fall into a discipline like transportation, environment, economic development, those type of spaces. And so as I've tried to talk about a lot of these challenges, I guess you are right, Miss Andrea, that especially when you're talking about a more holistic space, like looking at it, when I think of holistic, I think of like multifaceted, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and just again, when cities are looking to repair damages done, and looking at how the city should be itself in the future, and looking at different aspects, like you said, with the food insecurity, but like you were talking about with housing and transportation as well, and actually being a more inclusive city with the needs of folks.
I definitely have brought up to different cities how we can look into some economic development opportunities regarding, especially regarding our food systems and food systems work, looking into how we might be able to revitalize certain areas, right? And then also bringing in, and then I always bring in the conversation of transportation as well, and especially environment, right? We can't really have this conversation without thinking how this impacts the environment, or how this can either benefit the environment, and how we can kind of have this coexistence of all of these things. So actually, it's when we think about food systems planning, it has to be very multifaceted, right? So we actually can't talk about one thing without also discussing another thing. So we have to be very holistic, and we have to be very multifaceted in the way in which we approach food systems planning, especially on the municipal level, right? Because even though we're working to implement some of these resources, like whether it be community garden or whether it be an urban farm into a city, we also have to review what our policies look like as well, to make sure that these things are long-term and sustainable.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments for Dominique today? Okay, thank you all very much for joining us today, and a big thank you and round of applause to Dominique for joining us and engaging in this presentation and really rich discussion for the last 45 minutes. It's been such a pleasure. For those of you who joined us a little bit later, this webinar was recorded, and so we will post it on the Indiana Grown for Schools website here shortly, so it can be reviewed later. I also want to bring everyone's attention to our March webinar, which is March 23rd. It is a Wednesday, and it will be held around the same time from 12 to 1 Eastern. And in that presentation, Dr. James Farmer from Indiana University will be presenting on understanding the barriers to equity within farmers markets. So if you're interested in that, you can find that webinar opportunity also on the Indiana Grown for Schools website. It's under events and webinars, and you can register for that through Eventbrite. If you have any issues or questions with that, you can always feel free to contact me directly. My name is Megan, and I will put my email in the chat, but you can also find my email on our website under the Contact Us tab. Thank you all very, very much for joining us. And if no one has any other questions, I will wish everyone a really happy day.
Thank